I was going to say good to see you, but I can't see you. But I hope you might be able to see me. And if you want to ask me any questions, please do so. And I'm with Stefan.
Hello.
And Stefan's going to ask me some questions submitted in advance. But I'm also very happy to answer questions that have come through live in the next period. So thanks very much for joining me.
Great. No, well, we're in your house. Do you want to tell us where we are? And
so we are in College Road, Claremont Road, where we used to live, in Norwich, in our home. And I'm back home on Sunday evening after quite a heavy schedule. We did we did a hustings in Newcastle on Friday night. We did 3 hustings yesterday in Leeds, in Manchester for the ALDC, and then in Bolton in the evening, which is an informal hustings for the Northwest region, and then back to London this morning, and then up to Colchester to meet with members there, and then back up to Norwich. So that's been my schedule over the weekend, but back home, which is very nice, just for the evening and tonight. So do you want to ask me?
Yes, I do the first pre-submitted question.
Yeah.
The first pre-submitted question is actually about your personal values and what are your personal values and why. I guess that's sort of why you're liberal, but I think this person's asking specifically what are your personal values that you're bringing to this.
Well, I suppose the way I answer that is to say that all the way through my adult life, I've tried to live out the values that I believe in. And I suppose the first thing to say is that in everything you do, you try to make a difference to people's lives. That's ultimately what we must be about. And there's no point in going into politics, being a political party, if you don't actually aspire to make a difference to people's lives, because otherwise you're just commentating, you're carping from the sidelines. And so it's a very practical application of my liberal values. And I sort of, going back before I was ever elected to Parliament, I was elected first of all to Norwich City Council back in 1987 in a ward that we'd started to fight in Norwich, and we ended up by getting all of the councillors in that ward. I ended up being the leader of the opposition Lib Dem group on Norwich City Council, before I then stood down after 4 years to concentrate on fighting North Norfolk. I was a lawyer at the same time, solicitor in a law firm. I ended up specialising in employment law, dealing with discrimination cases, unfair dismissal cases, working for both employer and employee side. And I suppose the biggest thing that I did was in the 90s, when it became clear that some 5,500 women had been discharged from the armed forces for getting pregnant. This was a breach of the Equal Treatment Directive that had been established in a test case. But then 5,500 women who'd been unlawfully discharged had a right to claim compensation. No one knew how to calculate the compensation. So we set up a group of lawyers across the country, about 350 lawyers, which I chaired. And we took on the MOD in fighting for compensation for those women. And many of those women had quite glittering careers in the armed forces, which had been taken away from them by an unlawful act of discharging them. And then as a campaigning MP, taking on Tony Blair over freedom of information, it was in the run-up to the Iraq War, or the period around the Iraq War, and I wanted to find out who Tony Blair was meeting. I'd done a lot of work with The Guardian at that time to try to establish who was influencing him in the run-up to the Iraq War. And so I asked the question, who are you meeting at Chequers, and who have you met over the last year? And he refused to answer the question, said that they don't answer that question. So I challenged them under freedom of information, and we won a ruling in the end that he had to disclose the people he'd met at Chequers, and we got the list of the names. It became quite a big story at the time, the Chequers guest list. What actually emerged was that he was meeting with a whole load of B-list celebrities, but it established a very important principle that the citizen, whoever you are, has the right to know who the Prime Minister and ministers meet with and who are influencing them. And then I took on BAE Systems, a big arms company who'd sold a military air traffic control system to Tanzania, one of the poorest countries in the world. And it seemed likely that it was a corrupt deal. Claire Short in the government was campaigning to stop the government granting an export license. She confided in me at the time. I went to meet with her, and she helped me in the questions that I was trying to ask to get to the bottom of this. And we exposed what had gone on. The Blair government gave an export license to that outrageous deal. And it ended up with the Serious Fraud Office prosecuting BAE Systems. I had several meetings with the chief executive of the Serious Fraud Office, and was pushing him, and he was very receptive to what I was saying, that there must be compensation paid to Tanzania, and that finally happened. And I think the money went into schools in Tanzania. But I then, as a campaigning minister fighting for equality for mental health, and trying to establish the principle that people who suffer from mental ill health have the same right to access treatment on a timely basis as anyone else. And that principle is not met at the moment, and it's an outrage that it's not met. It's a discrimination at the heart of the NHS, and I will continue to fight for equality. I'm really proud of the fact that we introduced the first ever maximum waiting time standards this year. But at the heart of, I suppose what I'm saying is that it's people, it's giving people power, no second-class citizens, no one ignored, people treated equally. And I came across so many examples in my job as a minister where people have been badly treated, been ignored, particularly people with learning disability, with mental health problems. And my principle throughout is to fight for those people and to ensure that they have that they're treated properly by the system. That's an incredibly important principle. But then along with that, as a Liberal, I celebrate diversity, the fact that every individual has the right to lead their life exactly as they want to lead it, unless they're doing damage to somebody else. That's the John Stuart Mill principle. And along with that, we must always reject conformity, the idea that we all have to be the same in some way. And as Liberals, we want to celebrate the fact that everybody can lead their life exactly as they choose to, and to make the very most of their talents. And that, incidentally, is a very important principle for me, that every child in our country must be able to fulfil their potential. And it's a sad reflection of our times that still too many youngsters' futures are determined by the circumstances of their birth. And then finally, and then I'll shut up, I think it's also a really important principle for Liberals that along with freedom comes responsibility. So we have responsibility to one another in our communities. We have responsibility for the stewardship of our planet, and we have responsibility for future generations, and incidentally also to work internationally, to bring people together, to unite people, not divide people. So that, in a rather long nutshell, is something about my values.
You can let people know that we're on YouTube live as well as on Google Hangouts.
Okay.
So if you want to tell people, they can comment on the YouTube video if they've got questions, and if they can only see it on YouTube, post a question.
So comment on the YouTube video, post a question if you want to, and I'll try and answer them.
Terrific. So next question is about voting for Liberal Democrats, and it's from somebody who went to a hustings recently, goodness knows which one it was, asking, you might want to repeat the question back so people can hear, asking if it's a liberal age, which is a phrase they've heard you use, why aren't more people voting for Liberal Democrats?
This is, in a way, the great paradox. So the question, just to repeat, is I make the case in hustings sessions that this is, I think, in very many respects, a liberal age. There are loads of people out there who basically have liberal values, who are open-minded, who are dynamic internationalists, who are willing to allow people and enable people to live life as they choose to lead it. And I think it's particularly the case with young people, that they are fundamentally liberal in their attitudes. So why is it that at a time when there are so many people out there who share our values, that most of them don't actually associate themselves with the Lib Dems? And in a way, for me, the big challenge we face is to correct that, to make sure that this party does speak to their values consistently and clearly, and ensure that those people start to see, because we start talking about our values and what motivates us in our hearts, they can see that there is a consistency and a clarity of what we're saying, and that they can then feel genuinely that this is a party that speaks to their values, that in a way represents their values in an effective way. So that, I think, is at the heart of the challenge that the party faces, because if we can achieve that, if we can make people out there who feel liberal, if we can make them feel that this is a party that speaks for them, then I think the potential is enormous. But we first of all have to convince those people that we're relevant and that there's a purpose for this party, and that the only way we do that is clarity and consistency about our values, our liberal values.
Thanks. The next question is, what steps will you take to achieve this? I think this is in relation to some of the things that you've said.
Yeah.
What are the first few things that you would do as party leader?
Well, first of all, in terms of how I use my time, I want to be out there leading from the front. I don't want to be spending most of my time in Westminster. It's not somewhere I particularly enjoy being. I've never been particularly part of the club there. So I want to be out on the road. I want to be leading the campaign from the front, focusing very much on the electoral battles that we have to face, and building our case in Scotland and in Wales, and in councils around the country, working with campaigners in our party across the country. And I think it's incredibly important that the leader leads from the front in that respect. But there are other steps that I think we need to take in order to catch fire, as it were. I've likened us, and anyone who's attended hustings might have heard me say this, I've likened us to a dynamic startup that at the moment has a small market share, but could potentially catch fire and inspire people to rally to our cause. And it's this fact that there is an enormous potential market for us, because there are so many people who are fundamentally liberal in their attitudes. So what are the steps I think we need to take? First of all, I think we need to get our party sorted out. I think it needs root and branch reform. It's horribly overcomplicated, the structure. There are loads of committees that most people don't understand, including me, and how people get elected to those committees. It needs to be simplified, in my view. And fundamentally, we need to make sure that we apply our liberal values to the way in which we run our party. So, of course, intolerant of unacceptable behaviour in any way. Abuse of power is something that, as liberals, we should be very, very clear about, that it's not acceptable. But we've also got to be diverse, and it's a bit of an indictment of our party that we are the least diverse party in British politics, and we should be acutely embarrassed by that as a liberal party that fundamentally supports the idea of diversity, goodness sake. So we need to make sure that every person in our party has the chance to participate and the chance to succeed in our party. And one of the things I've suggested is that our claims for democratic legitimacy, in a way, as a party, is the fact that people can go, if they get selected by their constituency local party, they can go to the conference and vote for motions at conference. But there are very many people who can't get to conference. They may be disabled, they may be too elderly, they may be too young to go on their own. They may not be able to afford it, or their job may prevent them from going, if they're a teacher, for example. So ultimately, is that actually very democratic? And yet we have the potential in this electronic age to link everybody up, if they want to participate, into the conference debates and into the votes that take place at a conference. we could get people to be able to vote electronically. It's not beyond the wit of man or woman to do that. So let's be at the cutting edge of our internal party democracy. Let's demonstrate to other parties how we are doing it, how we're opening the whole process up to every member of our party if they want to participate. So that's the first stage, root and branch form of the way our party operates, so that it's lean and clear and accountable and open. Secondly, I think we need to become again a really effective election winning machine. And the truth is, I think that some other parties have moved ahead of us. We used to be respected as the campaigning party, but I think we've perhaps fallen behind a bit. There are great, great campaigners in our party, don't get me wrong. But I think across the country, we're not as good as we need to be. And we need to always apply the really important principle, which is, again, a liberal value, the community politics that has always been the basis of our work in communities. And at the heart of that is power to people, which I keep coming back to. But it's not about doing things to people, it's giving power to communities and to people. That's the difference, but particularly between us and the Labour Party, who do things to people. So that's the second element. And then the third element, which I think is just a critical ingredient of our future success, and that is that we become an intellectual powerhouse again. So back in the 60s, Joe Grimond, that great radical liberal, led the way. He brought people into the party, great thinkers, liberal thinkers, and he got a sort of engine going, and it enabled the party to, in a way, win the battle of ideas. And we've got some big challenges as a society, both in this country but also overseas, globally. We need liberal solutions to those big challenges. And I think that my insight is that if we win the battle of ideas, and if we can combine that with really effective campaigning, we can be an unstoppable force. That's my message to people. And then the final element of our route to success in the future is that we have to inspire a new generation of young people. We are nothing if we don't get young people on our side, particularly because they are fundamentally liberal in their attitudes. So this is a massive market for us. If we can speak to their values, if we can be radical and clear about some of the big changes that are necessary, radical reform of our antiquated drug laws, which criminalise so many young people, giving billions of pounds globally into the pockets of criminals. If we can be very clear about equal access to support if you suffer from a mental health problem, particularly important for young people that. If we can be clear about finding liberal solutions to our housing crisis, if we can do these things, then I think we can speak to young people and win them over and create and we can inspire that new generation of young people. And I think if we take those steps, then we can be, I think, a very effective force and build a liberal, progressive, radical movement of change.
Great. There's a question I'm going to read here in full, which came in before we started. Yeah. And it says, I would like to know, as somebody who used to vote Lib Dem, the following. Would you again support the Tories in the bedroom cut, tax in pensions, cuts in benefits, whilst giving tax cuts to the bankers who've received 100 billion in bonuses since 2010? What do you say to that?
So the question is about, would we work with the Tories again, doing things like the so-called bedroom tax and cutting tax for people on high pay and cutting other benefits and so forth. So my answer is as follows. First of all, I'm very clear that we did some really great things in government, advancing liberal values. I think about the pensions reforms. I think about my own work on mental health, which I think completely speaks to our values, the principle of equal treatment of everybody. I think the pupil premium is an extraordinarily valuable and potentially transformational social policy, which targets resources 2.5 billion this year at children from the poorest background and holds schools to account to ensure that they narrow and ultimately close the gap, the attainment gap between those children and the rest. And it's literally changing individual children's lives, and we should be very proud of that. But we also made mistakes. And actually, for me, the biggest mistake was the so-called bedroom tax. I was concerned about it at the time. I was reassured that because of the discretionary element of the money that local authorities would have, that they would be able to smooth over the impact of that. But the truth is, it hasn't worked as we hoped, and it's meant that people on very low incomes have ended up not being able to move because there are no smaller houses for them to go to, and ending up having a cut in their very low income. So that's why ultimately in the manifesto we argued for a change to that policy, but that was a mistake, and I would never contemplate doing anything like that again. Fundamentally, I've always regarded the Tories as the opposition. I've regarded Labour in a way as the competition, and I've spent most of my adult life fighting to defeat Tories, and the things that sort of drive me and motivate me are combating entrenched poverty, combating or fighting for social justice, that sense of powerful citizens, whoever they are, particularly those second-class citizens who get ignored by the system. You have to compromise if you're in a coalition, there's no doubt about that. And ultimately, we hadn't implemented any liberal values in the entire post-war period until the last 5 years. We were commentating ultimately from the sidelines. So the fact that we were able to do some really important liberal things, including also incidentally cutting tax for people on very low pay, these things were worthwhile. And indeed, the issue about cutting tax for the wealthy, we went along with that from the Conservatives. They wanted to do it. We went along with that because we secured in return a cut in tax for people on low pay, raising the personal allowance in that particular budget. I personally think it was a massive mistake because I think it went completely against any concept that we were all in this together. I think it sent out a dreadful signal that we were helping people at the top of the pile, even though that top rate doesn't bring in much additional revenue. And incidentally, the top rate of income tax is still 5p in the pound higher than it was for almost the entire period of Labour government, right up to just the last few months of the Labour government, the last few weeks of the Labour government. So we shouldn't be taxing high for the sake of it, but we should be taxing in a progressive way to ensure that we can maintain public services and support for vulnerable people. And we should incidentally also be seeking to shift the burden of tax away from work as far as possible and onto unearned wealth. I think that again is an important liberal principle.
There's another pre-submitted question, which is, what are you going to do to make politics sexier? Now, I assume this means more attractive to people to get involved with, rather than trying to sex up politics. There's probably enough of that already, but yeah. What are you going to do to make politics sexier for people? Right.
I would think back to the sexed up dossier on the Iraq War. We don't want more of that. My take on this is we have to be able to connect with people well beyond our party, and indeed with people who don't have that much interest in the minutiae of politics. And actually, I think that there is a role for involving and engaging with people who aren't necessarily politicians, but who the public know and like. So I just give as one example, Frank Bruno, who's been very brave talking about his mental ill health, and he's been open about it, and doing that has helped in reducing stigma of mental ill health, which makes it easier for the next youngster, perhaps another teenager, to come forward and be open about their mental health problems. So that's a really impressive act by that man. He's a very gentle guy. It's always worth being on the right side of him because he's much bigger than I am. But I met him in my office last year. He came to see me to talk about mental health. And I got on very well with him, and he put forward particular ideas, which ended up becoming part of what we called the Crisis Care Concordat, which set standards for crisis care and mental health for the first time ever. And in particular, the thing that he raised with me was the acute embarrassment he suffered from the moment when he was sectioned and 2 or 3 marked police cars turned up at his house. Police swarmed into the house, and he said any neighbour would have assumed that I'd committed some dreadful crime. But he was ill, and there was absolutely no case for a whole load of police officers to turn up in marked police cars. It's treating people with disrespect when they're ill. So we included that principle directly because Frank had raised it with me. But in return, you know, I've ended up meeting him on several occasions, and we've ended up getting on very well. And as a result, he's been very supportive of me in my work. But I think, you know, Frank Bruno connects with people in a way that a politician can never connect. And if we're doing things where we have a shared purpose with other people beyond politics, then we should be working with them. And in that way, I think you can connect with people in a way that the traditional sort of political route completely fails in.
Yeah, yeah. We've got our last pre-submitted question, and including the ones that have come through so far. So do you want to invite people if they have another question?
So if any of you have questions, I see many people watching in, looking in. If you have any questions, then just send in your question. How do they do it?
Type it into a comment if you're on YouTube.
Type it into a comment if you're on YouTube.
If you're on Google+, click on the Q&A button.
So if you're on Google+, click on the Q&A button. Send in your question. Very happy to try and answer any that you might have. Many thanks.
So we have one more, and that is, how do you ensure that public sector workers are motivated and loyal and happy, and therefore more productive?
Well, this is a fascinating question. So I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear it. How do we ensure that public sector workers are happy, respected, treated properly, and motivated to do their job to the best of their ability? Well, first of all, on pay, I recognise that public sector workers have taken a hit over the last 5 years. People have had to accept lower than index-linked pay increases, which has meant that ultimately pay has gone down in real terms. So I accept that, and I recognise the contribution that has made to getting public finances in order. I would incidentally always make the point that by at least having a plan for how we get public finances in order, we have avoided some of the dreadful crises that have happened in other European countries. I think of Spain and Portugal, where my understanding is that public sector workers there have actually taken a direct cut in pay, in many cases 5%, and I think sometimes 10%, quite apart from Greece. Now, obviously you can make distinctions between our different economies, but the scale of the deficit in the UK was pretty dramatic in 2010. So the case for getting public finances in order, I think, was nonetheless overwhelming. But I don't think you can now carry on with that, both because I think it would be wrong to do so, because they've already taken the hit, but I think also you couldn't do it economically, because public sector wages will fall behind wages in the rest of the economy, and you will lose people. People will vote with their feet, go elsewhere. You'll find it more difficult to recruit. So we have to treat people properly in terms of their pay. But I'm also really interested in looking at how we best value people delivering public services. And I was very struck when I met with the chief executive of John Lewis at the time. I think it was about 2006. And he said to me, if you could apply the principles of our partnership, where every worker in John Lewis is called a partner and has a stake in the organisation, you could apply those principles to the way you run the NHS, then it could be incredibly powerful. I've always remembered that comment. And for me, the interesting question is, how do you maintain the public service ethos, which is incredibly important, so that people feel motivated to do good, to deliver the best possible service to our citizens, but at the same time treat the employee, the public sector employee, better. Because too often you find, this is my experience, particularly in the NHS, you find very top-down organisations, you find people who feel that they haven't been listened to, that they're ignored. Coming back to that strand of thought that I was describing earlier, and you find people who feel disempowered. And where in the NHS and care services, social enterprises have been established where every member of staff has a stake in the organisation. So Bromley Care, for example, being one case in point, they absolutely maintain that public service ethos, but you end up with employees feeling much more empowered, employees being able to be much more fleet of foot than the traditional state organisation, much less top down, much less bullying culture. Kingston is another example of a third sector organisation running community health services. And I think this idea where you maintain terms and conditions for the public sector, but you give people a stake in their organisation so they have a say and they feel more powerful as people and as workers, I think that can be very powerful in terms of improving their quality of life, but also in improving productivity, because people feel motivated if they are in control rather than being bullied from the top down. And whilst in all of these organisations that have spun off into social enterprise, and incidentally, I have no interest in them in any sort of situation where they could then be captured by the private sector. I want this as a permanent solution, and I want their role protected. But I think where in all these cases there may have been some anxieties when it happened, but overwhelmingly once it's happened, employees see the real benefit of it and feel that they're treated better than they used to be in their old organisations. So I think this could be very empowering, and I think it's an attractive liberal alternative, because you have on the one hand the Conservatives who are often seem hell-bent on privatising things, of just letting private companies run everything. And the risk then is, it's not always the case, but the risk is you lose the public service ethos and you sometimes fragment services. And on the Labour side, sometimes or too often a conservatism, a refusal to contemplate any change of how things are run. And this is, in my way, a liberal alternative where we protect what's really important and good about public service, but you give power to the people working in those organisations.
The questioner can't remember where the quote comes from here, but the quote is, "One day in government is worth 1,000 sitting on the outside."
Yeah,
I don't know. The question isn't who is it. That's not a knowledge test.
Yeah,
but,
no, that's really frustrated me now.
But I recognise it too.
I've referred to it recently as well. So
anyway, what's your thinking of that quote?
Yeah.
What do you have? What can you bring to this leadership role from your experience in government? Is the question.
Right. Well, I do strongly feel that being in government is an aspiration that we must have as a party. Because I come back to what I keep repeating: what is the point of what we do? Why do we do this? Why do we spend so much time and energy knocking on doors, delivering leaflets, doing our casework if we're members of parliament or councillors? We do it because we want to change people's lives and give people the chance of a happier life. That's ultimately must be what we're about. And so that's my motivation. And the reason why I would always defend us going to government is that it gave us the chance to actually implement liberal things, liberal values. And, you know, if in my 2.5 years in the Department of Health, we managed to, we managed to cut by 50% the number of people who end up in a police cell in the middle of a mental health crisis. I'm really proud of that. Because it makes a direct difference to those people's lives. If you think about the trauma of being in mental health crisis and ending up behind bars. It's as a so-called place of safety, for goodness sake. It's unimaginable. The fact that we're rolling out a national liaison and diversion service, which diverts people with mental ill health and learning disability away from the criminal justice system, getting them diagnosis and treatment. No other country in the world is doing this on the scale that the UK or England is doing it. The fact that we've now got 900,000 people this year getting access to psychological therapies. The fact that we've now got 1.25 billion earmarked for the next 5 years for children and young people's mental health services, together with a blueprint for the modernisation of those services. The fact that we've introduced guidance to reduce the use of restraint, violence in inpatient mental health wards. There's a long, long list. The crisis care, mental health crisis care concordat. These are really important things that make a difference to people's lives. Introducing a cap on care costs for older people, never been done before. Lib Dems did it in government. Legislating for the Care Act, which is a really liberal piece of legislation about giving power to people, in focusing on their well-being, focusing on preventing ill health. Now, you can only do these things if you are in government. That's the whole point. We can only talk. We can commentate if we're on the outside. We can do it if we're on the inside. And that's why I'm totally ambitious for this party to aspire to being in government, because there's no point in us unless that's what we try to do. And when I say government, I mean central and local government. I treat local government just as seriously as a former councillor and as someone who believes in power close to people. Getting power in local government can transform people's lives just as much as central government can.
That leads on very nicely to the last question, I think, unless anybody else has any more, which is, where do you think the party could be in 5 years from now?
Well, because I think change happens very fast these days, and we see that in commerce, we see it in politics. The SNP, UKIP, garnered support very quickly, actually, and people no longer have sort of entrenched commitments to political parties. They behave like consumers. They will vote in one way in one election and in another way in another election. And so in that volatility that we now have in politics, we have a chance. We have a chance to connect with people and to pull them to our cause. And if we can do that effectively, and there's no God-given right to this, I'm not saying now that we are bound to succeed, but I think we have a chance of rallying people to our cause and success happening much quicker than we might imagine. And if that happens, then I think we could have a very successful election in 2020. We could win several seats back that we lost last time. We could win perhaps some seats that we haven't won in the past. No guarantee, absolutely. But if we win the battle of ideas, we are dynamic in coming up with liberal solutions which are attractive to people. And if we regain our preeminence in campaigning, then we become that unstoppable force. And I think that's the exciting thing about our situation now. Let's be audacious. Let's have this sense that we're at the start of something really big and that we could build something really dynamic and exciting. And in that way, you inspire your activists to go out and knock on doors, to deliver the leaflets in Darkest November and so forth. That's my ambition.
Someone has kindly told us that the quote came from Philip Gould.
That's right, I remember.
So
absolutely.
Thank you,
Thank you, whoever that was, yeah.
And we have no more questions, Norman. So thank you on behalf of everybody who's tuned in on YouTube and on Google Hangouts. This has been an experiment, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any final words, or we should give your voice a rest by the sounds of it?
Well, look, I've enjoyed this. I want to be able to communicate with people in whatever way. So earlier today, I was in Colchester meeting with about 40 local members who came along just to have a discussion and to hear me talk. We've had the formal hustings, but this is another way in which we can communicate. And I'm thinking off the top of my head now, but if I became leader, there's no reason why we can't do this sort of thing, to enable people to connect with me on a regular basis and to challenge me directly. Let's open it up in that way, and let's enable people, all those new members, to get involved directly in engaging with the leader. Thanks very much.
There is one more question.
Ah.
Sorry, it's just coming through. I hope you don't mind. It's about the EU referendum at the end of 2017.
Right.
How should we argue the case for continued membership? And I'm going to stop taking more questions
Okay.
just in case we do need to give your voice a proper rest.
So I think it's both head and heart. First of all, we've got to make the case about the importance of staying in the EU for the economy. And when I think about the number of jobs that are dependent on this, that's actually really important to people. We mustn't dismiss those dry economic reasons. And I just think about all those companies, international companies, deciding where they're going to base their manufacturing facilities or whatever. And if the UK was outside that single market, why on earth would they choose to base themselves in the UK? They want to hit 500 million people single market. They want to be in the market in order to distribute their product. And so that's really important. As well as retaining, incidentally, all those companies that are currently here, and indeed the City of London, which is quite a driver of economic activity in our country. Their preeminence as a market depends in significant part on the fact that we are within the EU. And then there's other issues like our relevance internationally, our influence with America and so forth. We would be diminished if we became isolated. So these are the sort of cold, hard facts, and we must argue that case. But there is also an emotional reason as well. And I just mentioned this story, I mentioned it yesterday, but when I was a child, we went out on holiday to Germany, and we went to visit my sister, who was doing a modern languages course, UEA degree, University of East Anglia, and she spent a year in Germany. And we went to see her in Göttingen, I seem to remember. And we drove one day to the East-West German border, and it was in the middle of the countryside, and you drove down this lane, and you got to the point where the barbed wire fence cut across the road. The road just came to a halt. You could see the lane continuing on ahead, but it was the other side of a ploughed tract where it was mined, and there were lookout towers placed along the border with soldiers, and you could see the soldiers, the East German soldiers, in the lookout towers, and they were looking over people working in the fields on the other side of the border. There's a village we could see in the distance. I can imagine it just in my head now. That's not that long ago. Just look how Europe has changed in the period since then. And this is a remarkable achievement for our continent. We've turned our back on conflict. We've chosen to work together and to trade together. We've brought all those countries from the Soviet bloc, including East Germany, into the European Union. And now we debate the most trivial things sometimes in European Council meetings. And I sat on 3 European councils when I was a business minister for a glorious 8 months in 2012 under Vince Cable. The Employment Council, the Trade Council, and what was the other one? Competition, I seem to remember. We were debating all sorts of things about, the ways in which the single market operates. It's so much better to be debating these issues than in conflict with one another or facing each other across a barrier between us. We've united people in Europe, and that's a tremendous achievement. And the case for therefore staying in Europe and maintaining that great project is overwhelmingly important. But final thing I'd just say is we must not close our minds, because we're liberals and we believe in reform and accountability and decentralizing of power and democracy. We must not close our minds to failures at the European level in that regard. So just as we are critical of the way government operates in this country, the centralization of power, we should also be ambitious for change at the European level. And I think in that way, you get a hearing for the pro-European case by recognising that things aren't perfect and that things have to change, and be the party that champions that change in Europe, giving power to people at the lowest possible level. Europe shouldn't be doing things that it doesn't have to do. It should be concentrating on the massively important things that can't be done within a single country: tackling climate change, tackling international crime, the absolute importance of the single market economically. These are the things that we need to focus on at a European level.
Great. Let's try again. Say
Good.
goodbye.
Cheerio. Bye-bye. Thank you very much for taking part. I hope you found it of some interest. Thank you.